My presentation is on education and socioeconomic status. I'm going to talk about what socioeconomic status is and how it affects a student's educational opportunities and performance. We're going to start off by defining socioeconomic status. So socioeconomic status is the social standing or class of an individual or group. It is often measured as a combination of education, income, and occupation. What this means for a student is that not only is their household income a factor in their socioeconomic status, but so is their parents' education. In North Carolina, around 60% of K-12 students are considered low income. Typically, the schools only measure socioeconomic status by income because that's really the extent of the information that they have access to. The way that they would consider a student low income is if that student qualifies for free or reduced lunch. It's important to point out that students of color are particularly influenced by this issue. Students of color are more likely to attend high poverty schools, which is a school where 75% of students qualify for free or reduced lunch. Black and Hispanic students are influenced most by this issue. They are the students who are at the highest rates attending high poverty schools. Around 45% of students of color are attending high poverty schools versus about 8% of white students. Now that we've defined socioeconomic status, we need to talk about what it affects because it affects pretty much every facet of a student's education and their life in general. A student who comes from a low-income family will likely have less access to food and health resources. Obviously, a student's health is just in general very important, but a student who has poor health or poor nutrition is going to perform worse in school. If a student has to devote more of their time and energy to thinking about how they're going to survive, then they're going to devote less of their time to their academics. Another aspect is that students who come from low-income families have less access to extracurriculars. This is, due to things like transportation and just the opportunity in general. Maybe they have to work a job in high school to support their families. Students who participate in extracurriculars are way more likely to receive a diploma and way more likely to go to college than students who just go to school and come home. If a student participates in extracurriculars, they're going to be more engaged in the classroom and in the class environment because they're more engaged with their peers. Something that's even more directly tied to academics is the access to tutors and study resources outside of class. Students who come from low-income families are not going to have the extra money to pay for tutoring or extra resources outside of class, and nearly 40% of K-12 students will seek this additional tutoring, so it's really necessary for some students. In America, public school systems strive to make quality education available for every student, regardless of where they come from. The truth is that they're just not always able to achieve this. Students who come from low-income families are just going to be affected more by these issues. It is important as teachers, though, to recognize how these students are affected and what resources teachers can use to accommodate these students. Bear with me because I know that this graph is a little bit confusing, but this is the official terminology that the government uses when they're talking about income and students. A student who comes from a low-income household is going to have less access to resources, and so is a student that attends a high-poverty school. So, for example, a student who comes from a really wealthy household is still going to have less opportunities than another student who comes from the same type of household if they go to a school that is a high-poverty school. High-poverty schools tend to have less resources than other schools or low poverty schools because they just don't have as many parent donors or parents who come from high income households who are able to give resources to the school. It's really important to recognize the combination of these things and how they affect students and how a teacher can perform in these different roles for individual students. It's also important as a teacher to recognize that just because you are a teacher at a low poverty school does not mean that you will have students who are all coming from high income households. There are a couple of things that teachers can do to accommodate low income students or students in high poverty schools to try to help them learn to the fullest of their abilities. The biggest thing that a teacher can do is to minimize student responsibilities outside of the classroom. I know that it may seem like a foreign concept to some of us to not have to do homework, but the truth is that studies show less homework is actually good for students. Students need time outside of class to do things like extracurriculars, and students who are already disadvantaged as far as income goes, they're just not going to be as able to complete homework outside of class or generally work outside of class. The best thing a teacher can do to make it fair for all of his or her students is to try to minimize the student responsibilities outside of the classroom and try to just focus on school in the classroom. An extension of this is setting aside class time for studying and practice work. As we talked about earlier, students from low-income households are going to be less likely to have access to out-of-school tutoring. It's important that as a teacher, you give all students an opportunity to study and do practice work in class so that you can work with them. Another pretty simple thing that you can do as a teacher to just try to level the playing field is to provide supplies for all of the projects in class. If you've given a project and you tell a student to just get their own supplies, you're going to see big differences between students who can afford to buy their own supplies and students who can't. Just adding on to that, it's also unfair of you to judge them based upon the quality of their supplies and not the quality of their project itself. This is something that's really easy to do. You don't really have to give the best supplies to students. You just have to give them all the same supplies for a project. Possibly the most important difference you can make in the classroom is to recognize the difference between challenging work and stressful work. Studies show that students who come from low-income households have already dealt with a lot more stress on average than students who don't come from low-income households. There's no reason that a classroom should be stressful. It should instead focus on learning. It's also worth pointing out that if a student is stressed in your classroom, they're just not going to retain information the same way as if they're relaxed and engaged. Here are the sources that I used for my presentation. I also just want to mention at the end here that this is a very nuanced subject, and a lot of teachers, even veteran teachers, don't really know how to deal with this issue effectively. Medical professionals are still deciding the best ways to teach students who are disadvantaged in this way, and these are just the resources that are available to us now. Thank you for listening to my presentation. This has been a really fun class.